storm came faster than anyone expected. The radios went silent. The maps stopped making sense. A Navy SEAL found himself trapped in the mountains with no signal, no backup, and no clear way out. Beside him was a German shepherd who did not look afraid, only focused. While technology failed and the mountain closed its eyes, the dog lowered his head and chose a path buried beneath years of snow.
Keep digging.
Not because he could see it, but because he remembered it. And somewhere in that white silence, a question began to form. When everything modern disappears, what is it that truly brings us home? The city lay far behind them, shrinking into a thin ribbon of lights as the convoy climbed toward higher ground. It was late afternoon, the kind of gray autumn hour when daylight seemed undecided about staying. Snow had not yet fallen in the streets, but the air already carried a sharp metallic cold that hinted at what waited beyond the last gas station and the final cell tower. Beyond the windshield stretched the foothills, dark, uneven shapes rising against a sky that looked bruised rather than blue. Elias Crow sat in the lead vehicle, one gloved hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the radio. At 44, he had the posture of a man whose body remembered discipline even when his mind drifted elsewhere. His hair, once dark, had thinned slightly at the temples and showed threads of gray, cut short in a style that belonged more to habit than vanity. His face carried the lines of cold nights and long missions, but his eyes, steel gray and observant, still held a quiet patience. Elias was not the kind of man who rushed conclusions. He listened first, even to silence. Beside him in the back seat, the German shepherd shifted its weight with a controlled grace that came from years of training. The dog's name was Sable. At 7 years old, Sable had the build of an animal in its prime. Broad chest, powerful shoulders, black and sable coat thick enough to turn away wind and snow. The fur around the muzzle had begun to lighten, not from age alone but from exposure, sun, frost, and dust from places most maps did not name. Sable's ears remained upright, constantly adjusting, as if the mountain itself were speaking in frequencies only the dog could hear. Unlike younger dogs that strained against restraint, Sable stayed still, conserving energy, eyes moving more than the rest of the body. There was nothing restless about him. He was alert in a calm, almost thoughtful way. The mission briefing replayed itself in Elias's mind as the road narrowed. A small team of civilian geologists had gone missing during a late-season survey in the mountain range ahead. They had checked in once, reporting deteriorating weather, then vanished from the network. Search and rescue units had been delayed by worsening forecasts. When the call reached the SEAL unit, it was already clear that this would not be a routine recovery. Mountains did not respect schedules, and Elias knew that better than most. The convoy slowed as the asphalt gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. Pines crowded closer, their upper branches swaying in a wind that had not yet reached the valley floor but promised to. The radio crackled briefly, status updates from the rest of the unit, then fell quiet again. Not dead, Elias noted, but thinner, like a voice traveling through too many walls. The second vehicle pulled alongside for a moment. Inside was Mark Delaney, a communications specialist in his early 30s, lean and sharp-featured, with a habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh when he thought no one was watching. Delaney gave a brief nod through the window, all business, then dropped back into position. He trusted equipment. Elias trusted patterns. They stopped at a clearing marked by an old wooden sign, its paint nearly stripped away by decades of weather. The name of the trail was barely legible. Elias stepped out, boots crunching against frost-stiffened ground. The cold bit through the fabric of his uniform, clean and immediate. Above them, clouds had thickened into a low ceiling, moving faster than before. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. The mountain was changing its mind. Sable exited the vehicle without command, landing softly and lowering his head to sniff the ground. His tail remained still, not tucked, not wagging. This was not fear. It was focus. Elias watched him for a moment longer than necessary, then scanned the tree line. No snow yet, but the air smelled different, heavy, like breath held too long. The team regrouped quickly. A handful of men, each shaped by training and routine, spoke in short sentences. There was no unnecessary movement. One of them, Aaron Price, a medic with a broad build and a calm voice, checked supplies with quiet efficiency. Price had the look of someone who had learned early in life that panic wasted time. Elias trusted him without needing to say so. They moved forward on foot. The forest closed around them almost immediately, sound dampened by needles and moss. The city felt like a story someone else had told. The path they followed was narrow, uneven, its edges blurred by fallen leaves and early frost. Sable moved ahead now, tethered loosely, his nose occasionally brushing the ground, then lifting toward the wind. Elias let him work. There was no need to rush. Minutes passed, then more. The light dimmed faster than it should have. Elias glanced at his watch, then at the sky. The clouds were no longer merely overhead. They were descending, swallowing the upper slopes. A faint wind threaded through the trees, carrying the promise of snow. The first flakes came without ceremony. One, then another, melting as they touched skin or fabric. Elias slowed, raising a hand. The team halted. The flakes thickened, not drifting, but falling with intent. The temperature dropped perceptibly, as if someone had opened a door to another season. Sable stopped abruptly. His ears angled forward, body tense but controlled. He lifted his head and looked not ahead, but slightly to the side, toward a darker line between trees. Elias followed his gaze. There was nothing obvious there, no marked trail, no signpost, but something about the space felt older, less disturbed. The radio hissed sharply, then fell silent. Elias pressed the transmit button. Nothing. He tried again. Only static answered. Around him, the others checked their own devices. The forest seemed to absorb the sound of their movements, growing quieter by the second. Snow fell harder now, the flakes larger, clinging to branches and shoulders. Visibility shortened. The mountain was closing in, not violently, but with a steady, indifferent certainty. Elias felt it then, not fear, but recognition. This was the moment when plans began to lose authority. He knelt beside Sable, resting a gloved hand briefly against the dog's neck. The fur was warm, solid, alive. Sable did not look at him, only forward and slightly left, muscles coiled, waiting. Elias exhaled slowly, eyes lifting once more to the sky that no longer offered answers. Behind him, the team waited, trusting him as they always had. The snow thickened, erasing edges, softening the world into something unfamiliar. The mountain did not roar or collapse. It simply withdrew its permission, and then it closed its eyes. The snow no longer fell as flakes. It came down as a wall, thick and relentless, pressing the forest into a narrow tunnel of white and shadow. What little light remained was scattered, broken into a dull glow that erased distance and depth. The mountain had finished closing its eyes. Now it began to speak, in static. Elias Crow moved at the front of the formation, boots sinking deeper with every step as fresh snow piled over the trail they had just walked. His breathing remained slow and controlled, measured against the rising wind. He lifted the radio again, thumb pressing the transmit button with deliberate calm. The answer was immediate and empty. A harsh hiss filled his ear, a sound without pattern or meaning. White noise. He tried a secondary channel, then a third. Nothing but the same lifeless rush, as if the mountain itself were exhaling into the device. Behind him, Sable lowered his head and shook once, scattering snow from his ears. The dog's pace slowed, not from fatigue, but from calculation. At 7 years old, Sable no longer wasted movement. His paws placed themselves carefully now, testing the ground before committing weight. The snow carried unfamiliar scents, layered and confused, but his focus did not break. His tail stayed low, steady, a quiet signal of attention rather than alarm. The men behind Elias closed ranks instinctively. Aaron Price adjusted the strap of his medical pack, his broad shoulders already dusted white. Price's face remained composed, lips pressed together, eyes scanning the ground ahead rather than the sky. He had learned long ago that panic often began above the neck. Mark Delaney stopped walking altogether, crouching slightly as he checked his equipment with quick, efficient motions. His jaw tightened when the screen remained dark. For a man whose world revolved around signals and connections, silence cut deeper than cold. The first tremor came through the ground, subtle enough that Elias might have missed it if he had not already been listening with his feet. It was not a sound, not yet. It was a vibration, a faint shifting that traveled upward through bone and muscle. Elias raised his hand sharply. The team froze. Another tremor followed, stronger this time. Snow slid from branches in heavy clumps. Somewhere above them, the mountain adjusted its weight. "Move," Elias said, his voice low but immediate, the kind that carried without volume. "Now." They stepped off the narrow trail, almost in unison, pushing through dense undergrowth toward thicker trees. The sound came then, a deep, rolling thunder that did not belong to the sky. Snow broke loose high on the slope to their right, not a massive wall, but enough to be deadly. The ground shuddered as white poured downward, swallowing the path they had occupied seconds earlier. Elias felt the pull of air as the slide passed, cold and sharp, knocking breath from his chest. He planted his boots and leaned into it, one hand gripping a tree trunk until the vibration faded. When the sound finally died, it left behind a silence heavier than before. They counted quickly. One missing. Mark Delaney was not where he had been. Elias turned, scanning through the falling snow. Visibility had dropped to a few dozen feet. Shapes blurred together. Trees looked identical, stripped of landmarks. He called Delaney's name once, then again. The wind swallowed the sound before it could travel. Another voice answered instead, distant and strained. It was Aaron Price calling from lower ground, his outline barely visible through the trees. Between them lay a broken slope, freshly covered, unstable. The mountain had done what mountains always did. It had divided. Elias assessed the terrain in seconds that felt longer than they were. The team could not regroup without crossing unstable snow. Staying put invited another slide. He raised his radio again, though he already knew the result. Static answered him, loud enough now to feel almost mocking. Sable stood beside him, body angled toward the darker trees to the left, ears forward. The dog had not reacted to the slide with fear. Instead, he had tracked its movement, head turning slightly, as the snow settled. Now he sniffed the air, short, controlled breaths, sorting chaos into meaning. Elias made the call. He signaled to Price, gesturing downward, then to the remaining men with him. The decision needed no explanation. Survival came before formation. They separated quickly, each group moving in opposite directions, bound by necessity rather than plan. Elias felt the moment of fracture settle into his chest like a weight. He did not doubt Price's ability to keep his people alive. He doubted the mountain. Within minutes, the forest swallowed all trace of the others. The wind rose again, filling the space where voices had been. Elias stopped, forcing himself to breathe, to listen. There was no sound now but snow and wind and the low pulse of blood in his ears. He was alone with Sable. The GPS unit clipped to his vest flickered once, then went dark. Elias stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then shut it off completely. There was no comfort in watching something pretend to function. They moved on, Elias choosing direction by slope and tree density, old instincts rising to the surface. Sable walked slightly ahead now, no longer tethered. His head dipped low, then lifted, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. He paused often, recalibrating, then continued. Elias did not rush him. The snow deepened. Each step required more effort. Elias felt the burn in his legs, the slow drain of energy that came not from panic, but from persistence. He adjusted his pack, conserving movement, counting breaths. Somewhere in the distance, another low rumble echoed, a reminder that the mountain was not finished shifting. Time lost meaning. The light dimmed further, blending afternoon into something closer to evening. The forest felt smaller, pressing inward. Elias realized then that he no longer knew exactly where they were. Not precisely. The knowledge did not frighten him. It clarified things. Sable stopped again, more abruptly this time. His body stiffened, head turning sharply to the right. Elias followed his gaze and saw it too. A break in the trees, a subtle depression in the snow that suggested something beneath. A line where the wind moved differently. A trail, or what remained of one. Elias stepped closer, crouching to study it. The snow here was thinner, disturbed in a way that did not match the rest of the forest. Older, compacted, long before today. He glanced at Sable. The dog did not look back. His focus remained fixed forward, muscles taut but patient, as if waiting for permission. Elias nodded once, mostly to himself. "All right," he said quietly. They turned away from where the team had vanished, committing fully to the unknown. Behind them, the wind erased their tracks almost immediately. The last link to the others disappeared, not violently, but completely. The radio crackled once more at Elias's side, a brief surge of static that spiked, then fell silent again. He did not raise it this time. Ahead, the forest deepened and the trail narrowed, leading them into a space where maps had little to say. White noise filled the mountain, and Elias Crow walked forward anyway. The forest thinned in a way that felt intentional, as if the mountain were guiding them without admitting it. The wind still carried snow, but here it moved differently, slipping between trunks instead of crashing against them. Elias Crow slowed his pace, not from exhaustion, but from attention. The ground beneath his boots had changed. The snow was packed tighter, layered in a way that suggested it had been disturbed long before the storm arrived. He stopped and looked around, forcing himself to orient by slope and sound. To the left, the land rose sharply, dark rock hidden beneath white. To the right, it dipped into a shallow basin where snow gathered in soft drifts. Straight ahead, the trees parted just enough to form a narrow corridor, darker than the rest, protected from the worst of the wind. Elias frowned slightly. It was not marked. It should not have been there. Sable halted several steps ahead, his body angled toward that corridor. The dog lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the surface of the snow, inhaling in slow, deliberate pulls. His ears remained forward, rigid with focus. At 7 years old, Sable carried himself with the confidence of experience rather than the urgency of youth. His coat was crusted with ice along the legs, the darker fur along his back dusted white, but his movements remained precise. He took one step forward, then another, testing the ground as if listening through his paws. Elias watched him closely. He had seen Sable hesitate before, usually when a scent broke apart or when terrain conflicted with memory. This was different. There was no hesitation now, only confirmation. The dog stopped again and looked back, not pleading, not impatient, simply waiting. It was a look Elias recognized, a question without words. Elias crouched, brushing snow aside with his glove. Beneath the thin crust, the ground felt firmer, not recent disturbance. Old. He closed his eyes briefly, pulling up mental images of outdated maps, patrol routes from decades earlier, the kind of details no modern system bothered to keep. He had learned early in his career that mountains remembered longer than people did. He stood and nodded once. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. They stepped onto the trail together. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time, winding between trees that leaned inward as if guarding it. Snow lay thinner here, wind-scoured in places, revealing dark earth and the occasional stone. Elias adjusted his pack, redistributing weight, conserving energy. Every decision mattered now. There was no team to fall back on, no signal to call for correction. Only forward. As they moved deeper along the trail, the forest grew quieter. The wind lost its sharp edge, replaced by a low, constant hush. Elias became acutely aware of his own body, the pull in his calves, the steady rhythm of his breath, the weight of cold settling into his joints. He welcomed the awareness. It kept him present. Sable moved with renewed confidence, head lifting more often now, scent carried along the protected corridor. His tail remained low but relaxed, a sign that he was no longer sorting chaos, but following something coherent. Elias let the distance between them grow slightly, trusting the dog to signal if danger appeared. The trail curved around a cluster of boulders, their surfaces slick with ice. Elias slowed, testing each step. A slip here would not kill him outright, but it would cost time and energy he could not spare. Sable crossed without pause, weight distributed evenly, claws finding purchase where Elias's boots struggled. The dog paused on the far side, glancing back once, then forward again. Beyond the rocks, the land dipped gently, opening into a shallow ravine. Snow lay deeper here, but the trees were older, their trunks thick and scarred. Elias noticed markings on one of them, faint lines cut into bark and nearly healed over. Old trail markers, human but long abandoned. He exhaled slowly. The path had existed. It had simply been forgotten. The realization shifted something inside him. Not hope, something steadier. Acceptance. They moved on. Time stretched again, elastic and unreliable. The light dimmed further, the sky hidden entirely by branches and cloud. Elias checked his watch out of habit and ignored what it told him. The mountain kept its own time. Sable slowed suddenly, body tensing. His head snapped to the side, nose lifting high. Elias froze instantly, one hand rising to still his own movement. He listened. At first there was nothing. Then he heard it, a sound out of place, a scrape followed by a muted clatter. Elias eased forward, every step deliberate. Through the trees he spotted movement. A figure emerged from behind a fallen log, moving awkwardly, dragging one leg slightly. The man stopped when he saw Elias, shoulders slumping with relief and fear in equal measure. The man was in his late 30s, lean to the point of gauntness, with a dark beard rimmed in frost. His parka hung loosely on his frame, torn at the sleeve and patched with tape. His eyes were sharp but exhausted, the look of someone who had been awake too long and slept too little. This was Daniel Mercer, one of the missing geologists, though Elias did not yet know his name. Mercer carried himself with the careful precision of a man used to fragile things, more accustomed to instruments than weapons. His hands shook slightly, not from cold alone. "I thought you were the storm," Mercer said, his voice hoarse, half a laugh escaping him. "Or a tree." Elias lowered his weapon slightly, but did not relax entirely. "You alone?" he asked. Mercer nodded, then shook his head, indecision flickering across his face. "The others went higher, looking for shelter. I couldn't keep up." He glanced at Sable, eyes widening briefly. "That thing led you here." "He did," Elias said. "Can you walk?" Mercer hesitated, then straightened. "I can move." It was enough. They did not linger. Elias adjusted Mercer's pack, redistributing weight, noting the way the man favored his left side. A strained knee, maybe worse. He would manage for now. Sable circled once, sniffing Mercer quickly, then returned to the front of the trail, focus unbroken. They continued along the path, the presence of another human altering the rhythm, but not the direction. Elias remained alert, scanning constantly. The trail narrowed again, twisting between dense undergrowth. Snow began to fall harder, the protected corridor losing some of its advantage. The mountain reminded them that nothing stayed safe for long. After another stretch of silent movement, Sable slowed once more, stopping near a cluster of young trees bent low under snow. He sniffed the ground, then the air, then turned sharply to the right. Elias followed his gaze and saw it. A faint opening in the trees, barely noticeable, leading downward. The trail was ending. Elias felt the weight of the decision settle onto his shoulders. The old path had carried them this far. Beyond it lay uncertainty again. He looked at Mercer, then at Sable. The dog stood poised at the edge, waiting, trust implicit. Elias tightened the strap of his pack and stepped forward. Behind them, the snow filled in their tracks. The trail that had never been drawn disappeared once more into the mountain as if it had never existed at all. The fire tower stood above the tree line like a thought the mountain had forgotten to erase. Its legs were steel, rusted at the joints, anchored into rock that had learned patience long before humans learned fear. Snow wrapped around the structure in uneven layers, climbing higher with every hour, pressing against the narrow stairway until only the top third remained visible. The wind struck it constantly, not hard enough to tear it down, but relentless enough to remind anyone inside that shelter was temporary. Claire Whitmore stood at the narrow window, gloved hands wrapped around a metal railing worn smooth by decades of other hands. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, her posture shaped by years of walking ridgelines and climbing lookout stairs in all weather. Her brown hair, usually tied back with careless efficiency, had come loose, strands escaping to brush her cheeks. Her face showed the marks of exposure rather than age, skin reddened by wind, eyes a steady hazel that rarely widened in surprise. Claire was not fearless. She was practiced. Years earlier, a lightning strike had killed her mentor during a routine storm watch, leaving Claire alone in another tower, listening to the radio fall silent. Since then, she had learned to keep moving forward even when certainty disappeared. Behind her, the small interior of the tower smelled faintly of metal, old wood, and damp fabric. A single lantern hung from a hook near the ceiling, its flame weak but stubborn. On the floor lay a man wrapped in a thermal blanket, his breathing shallow but regular. His name was Thomas Reed, a geologist in his early 40s, broad-shouldered even now, despite the way injury had reduced him to stillness. His dark hair was matted with sweat and snowmelt, and a deep gash along his lower leg had been hastily cleaned and bound. Thomas had the build of someone used to fieldwork and long hikes, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion rather than panic. Pain had narrowed his world, but it had not broken him. Claire turned from the window and crouched beside him, checking the bandage with careful fingers. She had no medical training beyond first aid, but she had learned what cold could do to a body if ignored. She adjusted the blanket, then pressed her hand briefly against his shoulder. "How's the leg?" she asked. Thomas managed a thin smile. "Still there," he said, "which feels like a victory." She allowed herself a small breath of humor, brief and controlled. "Good, we'll keep it that way." Outside, the wind howled louder, snow rattling against the glass in sharp bursts. Claire rose and crossed the small room to the lantern. She checked the fuel again, measuring what remained with a practiced eye. Not much. Enough for the night, maybe longer if she was careful. She lowered the wick slightly, dimming the flame, then returned to the window. The light outside was nearly gone. The storm had erased the horizon hours ago, leaving only shifting white and gray. Claire reached for the flashlight resting on the ledge. It was heavy, utilitarian, the kind designed to survive drops and neglect. She clicked it on and aimed it outward, sweeping slowly across the darkening trees. There was no answer, no movement, no reflection. She did not stop. Every few minutes she repeated the motion, arms steady despite the cold creeping into her muscles. She did not believe anyone would see the light tonight. That belief was not required. What mattered was the act itself. Keeping the signal alive meant keeping herself alive. Thomas watched her from the floor, his eyes following the rhythm of the beam. "You think they'll come?" he asked quietly, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to hear the sound of hope spoken aloud. Claire considered the question, then answered honestly. "I think we give them something to find." The tower creaked as a stronger gust hit, swaying just enough to be felt. Claire adjusted her stance automatically, feet widening slightly, body compensating without thought. She had learned the language of structures under stress. This one would hold. For now. Time passed in fragments. Claire checked Thomas's temperature, encouraged him to drink small sips of water, then returned to the window. The storm showed no sign of easing. Snow piled higher against the base of the tower, smoothing the landscape into something unfamiliar and dangerous. Somewhere out there, people were moving. Or not. The mountain did not announce its decisions. As darkness settled fully, Claire switched tactics. She shut off the flashlight and lit a small flare instead, shielding it from the wind with her body as she cracked it open. Red light bloomed, harsh and unmistakable, painting the snow and trees in violent color. She held it out the window as long as she dared, arm-burning, smoke stinging her eyes. When it burned too low, she dropped it into the snow below, watching the glow fade slowly rather than vanish at once. She closed the window and leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. For a moment, fatigue pressed in, heavy and tempting. She slid down until she was sitting, back against the metal, knees drawn slightly upward. She allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of stillness. Then she stood again. Thomas shifted, wincing. "You ever think about quitting?" he asked, voice rough. "Before this?" Claire shook her head. "No," she said. Then, after a pause, "After what happened before, I thought about staying scared. Turns out that takes more energy than this." The lantern flickered, then steadied. Claire adjusted it once more, then returned to her post. Outside, the storm continued its slow work, reshaping the mountain inch by inch. Far below, unseen and unknown to her, a dog lifted his head and turned toward the tower. But Claire did not know that yet. She only knew the light, and so she kept it burning. The trail did not announce itself anymore. It simply continued, narrowing and widening without warning, dipping beneath low branches and re-emerging where the wind had scoured the ground bare. Snow lay thick on either side, but the center of the path carried a different texture, packed and layered, as if many winters had pressed their weight into it long before this storm arrived. Elias Crow followed in silence, his steps careful, measured, conserving energy. He no longer checked his compass. Direction now came from slope, from the way the trees leaned, from the dog moving ahead of him with unbroken certainty. Sable led without hesitation. His head rose and fell in a steady rhythm, nostrils flaring as he pulled information from the air rather than the ground alone. At 7 years old, his movements had lost the reckless speed of youth, replaced by something denser and more reliable. His coat was stiff with ice along the legs, darker fur streaked with white, but his gait never faltered. He slowed only to confirm, never to question. Elias watched him closely, recognizing the pattern. This was not searching. This was recall. Behind Elias, Daniel Mercer struggled to keep pace, though he did not complain. Mercer's injured leg forced a slight drag, subtle but persistent, and Elias adjusted his speed to match without comment. Mercer was lean, his face drawn tight by cold and fatigue, but there was a stubborn clarity in his eyes. He was a man used to observing rather than controlling, accustomed to waiting for landscapes to reveal themselves. That patience now kept him moving when pain suggested stopping. The forest changed as they descended. Trees grew thicker, trunks scarred with old marks, some deliberate, others the result of storms long past. Elias noticed the way the trail curved around obstacles instead of cutting through them, the way it followed natural contours rather than defying them. Human-made, but respectful. The kind of path built by people who expected to return. Sable paused near a cluster of stones half buried in snow. He sniffed once, then twice, circling slowly. Elias stopped behind him, scanning the area. The stones formed a rough boundary, barely visible now, but intentional. A marker. Elias crouched and brushed snow aside, revealing more rock beneath, arranged with purpose. Not recent, old enough that memory had outlived documentation. He stood again, breathing out slowly. "You remember this," he murmured, not expecting an answer. Sable moved on. They followed the path as it narrowed into a shallow cut through the terrain, a place where wind could not reach easily. Snow thinned here, exposing frozen earth and roots. Elias felt the difference immediately. His boots found firmer ground. His pace steadied. The mountain, for the moment, allowed passage. As they moved, Elias found his thoughts shifting, not to fear or doubt, but to recognition. He had trained dogs for years, trusted them with his life, but this felt different. Sable was not reacting to immediate cues. He was navigating something internal, a layered map built from experience and repetition. Elias understood then that the dog was not simply following scent. He was remembering routes walked before, perhaps years ago, perhaps by others long gone. The world left traces. Sable collected them. The trail bent sharply, revealing a narrow clearing where snow had piled deeper. Elias slowed, scanning the edges. The wind whispered through the branches above, carrying faint sounds that might have been nothing at all. He listened anyway. The mountain had taught him that nothing was ever just nothing. They moved through the clearing without incident, and the path emerged again on the far side, sloping gently upward now. Mercer stumbled once, catching himself on a tree trunk. Elias turned instantly, steadying him with a firm grip. Mercer nodded, breath tight, but controlled. "I'm good," he said. "Just tired?" Elias met his eyes briefly, assessing, then released him. "Tell me when you're not." Mercer managed a faint smile and continued. The light dimmed further as the day wore on, the sky hidden completely by cloud and branch. Elias knew they could not afford to stop long, but he also knew that pushing too hard would cost them later. He watched Sable carefully for signs of strain. There were none. The dog moved as if the path itself were guiding him forward. They reached a section where the trail widened unexpectedly, opening into a small shelf carved into the hillside. Snow had drifted here unevenly, but the ground beneath remained solid. Elias recognized the shape immediately. A rest point, not accidental. Someone had once planned for people to stop here. He halted and motioned Mercer to sit. Mercer lowered himself carefully, exhaling through clenched teeth as weight came off his leg. Elias removed his pack and crouched beside him, checking the injury quickly, efficiently. The bandage held. The swelling had not worsened. Good enough. Sable circled the area once, then lay down near the edge of the shelf, facing outward. His posture was alert but relaxed, ears rotating slowly as he monitored the forest. He did not rest deeply. He guarded memory as much as terrain. Elias took a moment to drink, rationing carefully, then stood again. He studied the land ahead, trying to anticipate what came next. The trail continued, but thinner now, less protected. Snow fell harder beyond the shelf, the wind reclaiming its voice. They moved on. As they descended, the forest began to open. The trees spaced farther apart, their branches higher, allowing the wind to sweep through unchecked. Snow blew sideways now, stinging exposed skin. Elias pulled his collar higher, squinting into the gusts. Sable adjusted instantly, lowering his body closer to the ground, changing angle without breaking stride. Mercer lagged slightly, breath coming harsher now. Elias slowed again, matching pace. He could feel the weight of time pressing in. Somewhere ahead, shelter existed. Or it did not. Either way, stopping here was not an option. The trail curved one last time, then faded gradually, dissolving into open ground where snow lay deep and unbroken. Elias stopped, scanning the area. There were no markers here, no obvious continuation. The old path had done its job. It had carried them as far as memory could. Sable did not stop. He stepped forward into the open, head lifting, nose turning into the wind. He moved slowly now, testing, recalibrating. Elias watched closely, heart steady but attentive. This was the moment where instinct and memory met, where the past ended and choice began. Sable turned slightly, angling downhill, then paused and looked back. Not for approval, for acknowledgement. Elias nodded once. "Show me," he said. They followed him off the vanished trail and into deeper snow, committing fully to the unseen. Behind them, the last traces of the old path disappeared beneath fresh white, erased without ceremony. Elias understood then that Sable was not leading them forward so much as backward, along routes the world had forgotten but not destroyed. Memory lived beneath the snow, waiting for someone who could still read it. And Sable could. The slope revealed itself too late. What looked like a gentle descent was a sheet of ice hidden beneath wind-packed snow, slanted just enough to turn balance into a wager. Elias Crow felt the change under his boot a fraction of a second before gravity decided for him. The surface gave way, slick and uncooperative, and his center of mass slid past the point of correction. He dropped hard to one knee, the impact jarring his spine, breath punching out of his chest. His free hand clawed for purchase and found nothing but polished stone under a thin glaze of ice. The world tilted. Sound narrowed to the scrape of fabric and the hiss of snow breaking loose. Below him, the slope fell away into a narrow ravine, a dark cut in the white where depth swallowed detail. The rope snapped taut. Sable reacted without noise. The German shepherd's body lowered instantly, shoulders dropping, hind legs spreading to widen his base. At 7 years old, his strength was not flashy. It was dense. He dug his claws into the crust, muscles locking as the rope pulled against his harness. Snow sprayed as his weight shifted backward, every ounce of mass pressed into resistance. He did not bark. He did not strain forward. He held. Elias felt the arrest through his chest before his mind caught up. The rope burned across his glove as momentum died, leaving him suspended at an angle that made breathing awkward. He forced air back into his lungs, slow and deliberate. Panic would add weight the rope could not afford. "Hold," he said, voice calm despite the position. The word meant for himself as much as for the dog. Behind him, Daniel Mercer froze, eyes wide, breath caught halfway to a shout. Mercer's face had gone pale beneath his beard, exhaustion replaced by sharp fear. He was a careful man by nature, accustomed to studying fault lines and slopes, but this was not a diagram. This was consequence. He planted his feet and leaned back, adding what little counterweight he could without stepping closer. Elias tested the rope with a measured pull. It held. Sable held. The dog's ears were pinned back now, not in fear but in focus, his gaze fixed on the slope ahead, jaw set. His breathing remained steady, controlled. The rope hummed faintly under tension. Elias shifted his weight by inches, moving with the patience the mountain demanded. He found a small outcrop beneath the snow, pressed his boot into it, then another. The movement sent a fresh cascade sliding past his shoulder, disappearing into the ravine. He waited until the vibration faded. "Sable?" he said softly. The dog adjusted instantly, stepping back a half pace, redistributing weight without breaking tension. His muscles trembled, not from strain alone, but from effort held too long. Elias took the opportunity, pushing upward, finding better footing. The rope slackened slightly as his boots found purchase. With one final controlled movement, Elias rolled onto the slope and lay flat, chest heaving, face pressed against snow that smelled faintly of stone. He did not move for a moment. He listened to the mountain breathe. Then he pushed himself up. Sable stood where he had been, legs braced, eyes searching Elias's face for confirmation. When it came, the dog relaxed a fraction, tension easing out of his shoulders. Elias knelt and pressed his forehead briefly against the thick fur at Sable's neck, a wordless acknowledgment shared and released. Mercer exhaled shakily. "I thought—" He stopped, swallowed, and shook his head. "I thought we lost you." "Not today," Elias said. He rose carefully, testing his balance. His knee throbbed, but it held. He checked the rope, the harness, Sable's legs. No injury. The dog stood patiently, tail low, alertness intact. They moved on with greater caution, Elias taking the lead again, Sable close at his side rather than ahead. The slope eased after a short traverse, giving way to broken ground, littered with rocks half buried in snow. Elias guided Mercer across, placing each step, lending a shoulder when needed. Mercer accepted help without pride, conserving energy, eyes tracking Sable's movements with renewed respect. The wind returned as they rounded the ridge, louder here, carrying snow in stinging sheets. Elias pulled his collar higher and scanned the terrain. The ravine they had avoided continued below, a reminder etched in shadow. He did not look long. They reached a narrow bench cut into the hillside, just wide enough to pause without risk. Elias signaled Mercer to sit. Mercer lowered himself slowly, grimacing as his injured leg protested. Elias checked the bandage again, fingers efficient and quick. Swelling had increased slightly, but circulation remained good. It would hold if they did. Sable stood watch at the edge of the bench, ears rotating, nose lifting into the wind. He sniffed once, then twice, head angling downslope. Elias followed his gaze and noticed the way the snow drifted there, smoothed by wind that traveled consistently from one direction. A corridor, not a path, but a promise of easier movement. They resumed, descending cautiously. The ground changed again, rock giving way to packed earth beneath the snow. Elias recognized the shift and allowed his pace to quicken by degrees. The mountain had tested them. They had answered. It did not press further, at least not yet. As they moved, Mercer spoke quietly, words rationed. "I've worked slopes like that," he said. "On paper, never trusted them." Elias nodded without looking back. Paper doesn't feel weight. They descended into a stand of older trees where the wind softened and the snow lay deeper but calmer. Sable moved ahead again, confidence restored, his gait smoothing as the terrain forgave. Elias watched the dog with a new clarity. He had trusted Sable before. He trusted him differently now. The light thinned toward evening, the sky a uniform gray pressed low against the forest. Elias gauged the distance they had covered and what remained unknown. He did not think of the fall again. He thought of what held. They reached a shallow depression where the ground dipped and rose again, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Elias stopped and considered. It was not shelter enough to stop long, but it was enough to breathe. He allowed them a brief pause, checking gear, redistributing weight, pressing a hand against his knee until the ache dulled. Sable settled briefly, then stood again, attention drawn forward. The dog's posture changed subtly, alertness sharpening. Elias followed the line of his sight and saw nothing immediate, only the continuation of terrain and snow. But he trusted the signal. They moved on. Behind them, the slope they had crossed gleamed under fresh snow, the evidence of the near fall erased. The mountain did not record mercy. It only recorded weight and time. Elias adjusted the rope once more and tightened his grip. He walked forward, knowing exactly what had saved him. Not speed, not strength alone, mass applied with purpose, a living anchor that did not let go. The light appeared as a mistake. At first it seemed no different from the way snow sometimes caught the eye, a brief shimmer where nothing solid existed. Elias Crow slowed, lifting his hand slightly. The forest ahead was muted and narrow, branches bowed under weight, the air thick with falling white. He narrowed his gaze and saw it again, faint and steady, not reflecting, but emitting. A weak glow, red at the edges, softened by distance and storm. Sable stopped at the same instant, his head lifted, ears angling forward, body tightening into a posture Elias had learned to trust. The dog did not bark or strain. He simply fixed on the direction of the light and waited. Daniel Mercer squinted past Elias's shoulder, breath shallow. "You see that?" he said quietly. "I do," Elias answered. They stood still for several seconds, letting doubt burn away on its own. The light remained. It did not flicker or vanish. It held its place against the storm, patient and stubborn. Elias adjusted his pack and shifted his grip on the rope. "That's not weather," he said, and Sable moved. The descent toward the light was slow and careful. The terrain sloped unevenly, snow hiding changes in grade that could turn a step into a fall. Elias placed his feet deliberately, following Sable's line without question. The dog moved with purpose now, head high, pace steady as if something had locked into place inside him. Memory and intent aligned. The light grew stronger as they closed distance, resolving into a clearer shape. A tower emerged from the storm, skeletal and tall, its legs disappearing into snow that had climbed halfway up the structure. Metal groaned softly as the wind pressed against it. Above, a small cabin glowed faintly, a lantern's warmth fighting the dark. Elias felt the shift inside his chest before he named it. Relief sharpened by caution. They reached the base of the tower and paused. Snow had piled thick against the lower steps, forming an uneven ramp of ice and drift. Elias tested it with his boot, then nodded to Sable. The dog climbed without hesitation, claws finding purchase where Elias's boots struggled. Mercer followed last, moving carefully, one hand gripping the railing, breath tight but controlled. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, heavy with the smell of metal, old wood, and fuel. A woman stood near the window, her posture rigid from hours of vigilance. She turned as the door opened, eyes widening once, then settling into a steady focus. Claire Whitmore was tall and lean, her ranger uniform worn and dusted white, brown hair pulled back but frayed by cold. Her face showed fatigue without surrender, eyes clear and alert despite the long night. She did not rush forward. She assessed first. "You're real," she said, voice calm, almost flat, as if she had already decided panic was unnecessary. Elias nodded. "We are." Behind her, on the floor, lay another man, wrapped in a blanket. Thomas Reed was broad-shouldered, his face pale but conscious, dark hair damp with sweat and melted snow. His injured leg was bound tightly, the fabric stained but controlled. He lifted his head slightly at the sound of voices, eyes flicking from Elias to Sable and back again. Claire exhaled once, a slow release she did not try to hide. "I kept the light on," she said. "Didn't know if anyone would see it." Sable stepped forward, sniffing the air, then moved to Thomas Reed and sat beside him, body angled protectively. The dog's presence shifted the room, grounding it. Thomas's shoulders eased slightly, a reflex he did not question. Elias crossed the small space and knelt beside Thomas Reed, checking the bandage with efficient hands. "You stable?" he asked. "Stable enough," Thomas replied. His voice was rough but steady. "She did most of the work." Elias glanced at Claire, acknowledging without ceremony. She returned the look with a brief nod. They worked quickly, quietly. Elias checked supplies, redistributed weight, assessed the condition of both injured men. Claire gathered what little gear she had, movements precise, conserving energy. Mercer sat heavily on the bench, relief draining him faster than exhaustion had. Outside, the storm continued, indifferent to reunion. Elias returned to the window and scanned the forest below. Visibility remained poor, but the light from the tower cut through it in a way that felt purposeful now. He turned back to Claire. "We don't stay," he said. "Not long." "I figured," she replied. "This place holds until it doesn't." They prepared to move. Elias helped Thomas Reed to his feet, testing weight carefully. Thomas gritted his teeth, but remained upright. Claire adjusted his blanket and tightened the wrap, her hands steady. She did not offer encouragement. She offered competence. As they gathered at the door, Elias paused, looking once more around the small cabin. The lantern burned low but steady, its flame reduced to a careful line. Claire reached up and extinguished it, plunging the room briefly into shadow before opening the door. Cold rushed in immediately, sharp and uninvited. They stepped back into the storm together. The descent from the tower was slower, burdened now by injury and fatigue. Elias positioned himself between Thomas Reed and the slope, Sable moving ahead, Mercer close behind. Claire brought up the rear, eyes scanning constantly, posture alert despite exhaustion. She moved like someone who had learned to function when fear was no longer useful. The light above them faded quickly as snow filled the air. Within minutes, the tower was gone, swallowed back into white. The signal that had not been a signal returned to being just another absence. They did not speak as they moved. There was no need. Survival demanded focus, not commentary. The forest closed around them again, familiar and dangerous in equal measure. Elias felt the weight of the moment settle in quietly. They had found each other. That was enough. For now. Sable led them onward, head high, steps sure. The storm pressed in from all sides, but the path ahead remained open, however briefly. There were no cheers, no declarations, only the shared understanding of those still standing. They moved on in silence, alive. Morning did not arrive cleanly. It came in layers, thinning the storm rather than ending it, turning the roar of the night into a tired whisper. Snow still drifted, but the wind no longer pushed it with intent. The mountain loosened its hold. Elias Crow stood at the edge of a shallow clearing where the trees bent back just enough to expose a slice of sky. His breath no longer tore at his lungs. He listened, not to the forest this time, but to the radio clipped to his vest. For hours it had been dead weight, a promise that refused to answer. Now it crackled once, sharply, then steadied into a low, imperfect signal. He lifted it slowly, as if sudden movement might frighten the sound away. "Crow to any aircraft in range," he said, voice even, words measured. Static pressed back for a moment, then parted. A voice cut through, distant but human, edged with professional calm. "Say again, Crow." Elias closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "We have 3 survivors, 2 injured. Coordinates incoming. Weather breaking." He read the numbers from memory and terrain rather than screen, speaking them carefully. The reply came faster this time, confidence threading through it. "Copy. Bird is inbound. 20 minutes." Elias lowered the radio and turned to the others. Daniel Mercer leaned against a trunk, exhaustion finally allowed to settle into his bones. Thomas Reed sat on a pack with his injured leg extended, pain etched into his face, but no longer sharpened by fear. Claire Whitmore stood a few steps away, arms crossed against the cold, posture steady, eyes lifting toward the clearing sky. She did not ask if the call had gone through. She had heard it in Elias's voice. Sable sat at Elias's side, chest rising evenly. Ice clung to the fur along his legs, and the dark saddle of his coat was streaked white where snow had melted and refrozen. At 7 years old, he looked older in the soft light, not worn but finished, like a tool shaped by use rather than time. His ears rotated slowly, tracking the distance. The minutes passed without urgency. The mountain had said enough. Elias checked gear, redistributed weight, tightened the rope one last time. He did not pace. He waited. The sound came as vibration before noise, threading through thinning cloud and branch. Elias lifted his head and felt it settle into place inside him. He reached to his belt and drew the flare gun, fingers steady despite the cold. When the helicopter broke through the cloud line as a dark shape against pale morning, he raised the launcher and fired. The flare arced upward, red and deliberate, burning a clean line through the sky. It did not flicker. It held. The helicopter adjusted immediately, banking toward the signal. Rotor wash flattened snow into widening circles as it descended beyond the trees. Elias kept the flare raised until it burned down, then dropped it into the snow and signaled with his arm, movements clear and unhurried. They moved in order. Mercer first, assisted without commentary, his weight lighter now that the night had released him. Thomas Reed followed, jaw set as pain returned with motion, relief colliding with exhaustion. Claire stepped forward next, pausing only once to glance back toward the forest that had held her tower. She said nothing. She did not need to. Elias remained until the end. He knelt beside Sable, resting a gloved hand against the thick fur at the dog's neck. The warmth there was solid, familiar. He did not speak at first. "Good work," he said quietly. Sable leaned into the touch, tail moving once, slow and measured. He did not look at the helicopter. His eyes stayed on Elias. They lifted together. The mountain fell away beneath them, trees shrinking into patterns, slopes revealing their true shapes in daylight. The storm retreated into scattered cloud, its work complete. Inside the helicopter, the noise was constant, but no longer hostile. Mercer closed his eyes. Thomas stared out the window, jaw unclenched for the first time. Claire sat opposite Elias, hands folded loosely, posture softened by fatigue that no longer had to be resisted. She met his gaze and nodded once. As the aircraft cleared the final ridge, sunlight spread thin and pale across the snowfields. Elias reached down and rested his hand on Sable's head again, fingers pressing lightly between the ears. He thought of the hours without signal, the maps that had ended too soon, the old paths buried beneath snow. He understood now that technology had not failed them. It had simply reached its edge. Something older had carried them the rest of the way. The radio crackled again, clear and present, a small, ordinary miracle. Elias did not answer it immediately. He watched the city lights appear far below, faint but steady, and felt the quiet certainty of return. When he did speak, his voice was calm. "Crow, we're on our way." Sable closed his eyes briefly under Elias's hand, then opened them again, alert as ever. Loyalty was not a promise for him. It was memory, weight, and choice. The mountain receded behind them, allowing departure without comment. Dawn carried them home. God does not always remove the storm. Sometimes He allows the storm so that we remember who we are when everything else is stripped away. He allows us to discover that help can come through unexpected hands, faithful hearts, and companions who never let go. In daily life, we face our own mountains, moments when plans fail, when answers do not come, when the noise disappears and we are left alone with our choices. In those moments, faith is not loud. It is steady. It is the decision to keep moving forward, even when the path is not visible. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect on who has been a guiding presence in your life. A person, a memory, or a quiet belief that carried you through difficult ground. Share this story with someone who may be walking through their own storm. Leave a comment to let others know they are not alone. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this still matter. And if you feel it in your heart, write Amen in the comments. A simple word of faith, a reminder that even in silence, God is still guiding the way. May God bless you, protect you, and lead you safely through every mountain ahead.